Greetings, everyone. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to another episode of In the Prog Seeds Tuesday night. We've got in the house tonight, we've got Chad Hutchinson. We've got the professor of Prog, Ken Golden from the Laser's Edge, our center square, Chuck Alvarez, Stephen Reid all the way from Scotland. We got our third New Yorker here, Eric Porter. We've got from Chicago, Mr. Louis Nasser. And the third New Yorker, or the second New Yorker, or the first New Yorker, whatever. That's myself, Pete Pardo. How's everybody doing? We've got a pretty cool topic today. This one has been suggested by Mr. Porter. He and I were talking a couple weeks back, and he's like, well, what about like a show on some of these prog bands who've had like a million lineup changes? And we have everybody, you know, who's interested in the band talk about their favorite lineup of that band and their least favorite. And then maybe like a musician that they would have loved to have seen in that particular band. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And the band we're talking about, perfect for this episode because they've had a million lineup changes throughout the years. King Crimson, all right, going back to 1969. They're still playing today. They have like about 58 different lineups, I think, or something like that. I don't know. I think I'm exaggerating just a little bit, but many really good ones. Some not so good, but again, it all is a matter of taste. So be interesting to see what everybody comes up with. So I'm asking, we're going to go around everybody once. We'll do our favorite first, then we'll do our least favorite, and then we'll, at the end of each person's least favorite, mention who you would have loved to have seen in King Crimson for a spell. So we're going to go Chad, Ken, Chuck, Stephen, Louis, Eric, and myself, and then we'll go flip back around again. So Chad, kick us off with your favorite King Crimson line.
Man, I've been on here, what, 3 times, and I go first twice? This kind of sucks.
And I'm telling you, throw you into the Lions den right off the bat, right?
It's part of your hazing.
You're a noob. You're the noob, you know.
You know, I'm going to blame Luis and Ken, both of them.
Why not?
All right. Well, you know what? This was a really fun exercise because I realized that I like a lot from every era of Pink Floyd. Jeez.
Wow.
Of King Crimson. I don't know why I was thinking about Pink Floyd. Somebody mentioned more in the preamble. But as far as King Crimson, yeah, I mean, every era has some stellar moments, and you know, you can easily pick the first album. I mean, it's the classic, right? It's the classic. It's the ugly. It's the awesome.
George doesn't think so.
I know. Too bad George isn't here. I really wanted to show that to him.
I asked him, because I'm going to sit that one out. Nope.
I asked.
But yeah, I mean, with the rest of that first era, I think that's the best of the, I'll say the 4. In the Wake of Poseidon's a little bit less, and then for me, Lizard gets less, and then Islands is kind of the weak point of the first 4. Still got some cool stuff on there, but then you get in the middle period is pretty intense. I mean, it starts to get a little metallic at times. You bring in John Wetton, you bring in Bill Bruford, then you jump to the 80s, and you get things like, let me see if this works. Check this out. You get, nice. Yeah, you get that. That's not exactly the way I wanted it to work, but it worked anyway. Well, that's what I wanted to do. So, yeah, you get Discipline. Sorry, I have a delivery. Thank you. Beverage delivery. But I didn't go as far as I really like things like Vroom. Boy, this is not working the way I thought about. I should have tested it. All right, so
nothing like testing technology on the fly, right?
You know, he needs. You know what he needs. He needs the wizard, Rick LeBlanc. That's
just going to say that.
Yes.
You know, I had this working earlier, and it didn't. It's not working the way I want it to. So anyway, let me delete that. So I like when I really got into King Crimson heavily. Like in college, friends of mine tried to introduce me to it, and a guy made the mixtape and gave me a sampling across the whole catalog, and I dug into it. I ended up getting that first box set, The Great Deceiver, and really enjoyed that. So I got everything from every era. But then the first new album that came out after that was Thrak, preceded by Vroom. And I loved Room. I really enjoyed Thrack. It's not quite their classic material, but it played into my decision of where I was going to go with my favorite. So I decided, no, I don't think I can quite go in the new era. I can't quite go the first era, because there's something exciting about that middle era. And I went back and I listened to all three: Lark's Tongues, Starless, and Red. And Starless, I put that aside first. It's still great. And then it was between Lark's Tongues and Red. And I listened to both of them back to back. And as much as I love Starless, I got to go with Red. I've got to go with Red. The aggression, some of the bass playing by John Wetton, like on Starless, is insane. In the middle, it's such an off-kilter groove. It's amazing. The drumming on One More Red Nightmare by Bill Bruford, with those crash cymbals at the beginning, it's just it borders on angry. And Red obviously is a classic. It's a phenomenal album. It's a shame that it came out after they technically broke up, but an incredible record. And that is by a smidge, that is my pick over Lark's Tongues and Aspic.
So for you, the trio, that's all you need. Those three guys, that does it for you. All right.
Well, a couple special guests on the album, Ian McDonald and a couple of other guys came back to play here and there. But yeah, that trio was spectacular.
Cool. All right.
Nice.
Sounds good. All right. Ken.
So first thing I want to say is there is no bad King Crimson. I mean, there just is not. I mean,
100%.
What we're calling, our least favorite is better than 99% of the bands out there that we listen to. I mean, it was, the band followed Robert Fripp's vision, and he has a very high standard, and whatever he could play this. I mean, he's a guitarist who could play with whoever he wants to play with, right?
Mhm.
So he picks and chooses, and he always plays with interesting people, and somehow you don't think it's going to work, and it works. You listen to Lizard, and to me, like, Lizard is kind of like the outlier in the catalog, but to me, Lizard is like, that's their jazz album. I think we talked about that in the past. It's a beautiful album, and for me, that works. Any one of the lineups, in some way, shape, or form, it's not a sellout. I mean, this is a band that has never sold out. I mean, the biggest sellout is what, Neil and Jack and Me, maybe, or something like that. I mean, it just,
Or Heartbeat.
a Heartbeat. I mean, it's
Still a great song.
Yeah, and it's not even a bad song, and it's a good album. It's on a good album. So, so when we're talking about the best, their best is, we're at the top of the mountain, and their worst, their least, we're pretty close to the top of the mountain. That's my opinion. So, whereas, when we talk about other bands, it seems like there's much more variation between the highs and the lows. We talk about Yes, or, ELP or Genesis, here we had a show, you can't compare the worst King Crimson album to Calling All Stations or, We Can't Dance, right?
Mhm.
It's not, it's not in the hot, their worst album is not in the hot seat. So I like all of them, but the one for me, the one lineup which really stood out the most was the one behind this one. This is my one visual aid. King Crimson, The Great Deceiver. To me, that's the classic lineup, because that's the lineup that, well, I guess later on they repeated, there was repetition in the lineup, but we're talking about Lark's Tongue and Starless and Red and of course USA. To me, there's something about that lineup that's just pure magic all the way through. British bands don't tend to improvise. King Crimson, that lineup of King Crimson improvised, and that's why I'm holding this up, because if you have The Great Deceiver, there's just tons and tons of improv. And, you know, we talk about all the other prog bands of that period. Genesis was not, they weren't improv. ELP, as much, you know, my favorite band, as much as I love ELP, that was a very scripted show when when you went to see them. King Crimson, that period of King Crimson, and later as well, but that period of King Crimson, man, those guys were taking chances, and they weren't playing the same thing the same way every night. It was always a bit different. These guys were walking the tightrope, and they were phenomenal musicians. You know, Wetton, great bass player, great vocalist. It fits the music. I mean, I couldn't think of anybody else that I'd want to hear singing. Not to say that he's my favorite vocalist, but man, he just fits that music perfectly. You know, if there's any shortfall in that band, maybe David Cross, you know, but who would you replace David Cross with? So, no. I'm getting a phone call. Let's see if there's something good. No.
Steve Feigenbaum, he woke up.
No, it was actually a spam call. So I get spam calls all the time. So, you know, when I never got to see this lineup. My first Crimson shows were the 81 with Discipline. And even that band, to some degree, would improvise. They were taking chances on stage. That core lineup, to me, that's like perfection. That's those three albums. It can't get better than that. I mean, and as I said, we're talking about some of these other lineups. They were great. I mean, they were maybe not as good. So yeah.
Bruford, Wetton, Fripp, Cross.
Yeah.
And Muir.
Yeah, and then Jamie. Yeah, and that's the thing. Like with Jamie Muir, man, he was the X factor. He really was the X factor. I mean, it was. I mean, he brought that. I mean, he came from an avant-garde, you know, improv, jazz genre, and he brought something to that band that nobody else that was doing rock had. And you know, it's a shame live. He only played live with them. What was like 6 weeks or 6 shows or something like that.
It was
very
like
limited.
I think like about 14, 15 shows.
Yeah, very limited. And then he was gone. But you listen to what he did on that album. There was nothing like those three albums. That those were, you know, other bands copied it, but each one is just a little different, and they're just fantastic albums. Great musicianship. I got no fault.
I hear you. Good choice. Chuck, what do you got?
Oh man, well, there's not much that we can say about King Crimson that hasn't been already said already. But you know, King Crimson is one of my favorite bands, period. You know, so that there are some times where of the 6 bands, the top 6 prog bands, you know, Genesis will always be my favorite band, but I prefer to listen to King Crimson more than I do any of the other bands. You know, I love King Crimson. And that, as mentioned, you know, Kenneth mentioned, you know, there really is no bad King Crimson, you know, no matter what's like from the beginning stages of with Greg Lake and Mike Giles on drums, you know, with, you know, you're talking, and Ian McDonald playing keyboards and saxophone. And then you just saw the band just progress from that point onward. I always felt, personally speaking, and so I always felt that Islands was a very underrated album. It's probably, in my opinion, the most underrated album in the entire catalog. Love the album. But just like everyone else, you know, this lineup right here, you know, what's Cross, Fripp, Bruford, and Wetton, and Muir, you know, they just went on to just basically just take the King Crimson name and just make it a household name. You know, Lark's Tongue and Aspic is my favorite album by King Crimson. And, you know, just the overall improvisation and the fury of these bands, you know, from Lark's Tongue. And remember, most of Starless and Bible Black is live. You know, they just added to it. And then you have the Magnificent Red and USA, and you have just one of these amazing bands. And go to the, you know, and then you also go to the Discipline lineup as well. You know, they were great. You know, what's another band? What's it that just hopefully I wish that they had stuck around a bit more, but you know, Fripp, he knew when to get rid of it. And I was actually listening to Absent Lovers earlier this morning, and that's still just an amazing album. I'm surprised, I'm just kind of surprised and saddened that they actually broke up right after that album was recorded. You know, but my favorite lineup will always be the 72, 74 lineup. I just think that right there is the definitive King Crimson.
There you go.
He's not wrong.
Nobody's gonna be wrong
Love
on
him.
the show.
Mm-mm.
Stephen, what do you got?
Well, I might be an outlier here because, hello, my name's Stephen and I've never seen King Crimson live. Okay, so there's one thing. Okay, not even aware of the last time they played anywhere near me, but there you go. And I'm always, or my bank balance is always frightened of a band that has lots and lots and then an awful lot more live albums. So I haven't really investigated as much live output from this band as I probably should have and probably would like to. That in itself, especially in more recent years, moves a whole lot of lineups right out of the equation for me straight away. Because there's a lot of lineups in this band that haven't even put anything on record. That's unusual in itself for a band that's been, you know, with a lot of breaks, but such a constant over the decades. But really the choices are it's remarkably difficult. This is remarkably difficult. And I'm going to go back to something that seems to be a theme for me with this style of show, which is there's quite a difference between best and favourite. Or there is for me anyway, and there seems to be for me quite often when we do these kind of shows. So I would say personally that the best lineup, the best album is Reid. 1974, it's Fripp, it's Bruford, and it's Wettin. It's just phenomenal. I love it. Absolutely outstandingly good. But then you can look at the debut. So you've got Fripp and Giles, Lake and MacDonald with the lyrics of Peter Sinfield. And I just think that's an outstandingly good album. But when you ask me my favourite lineup, well, I immediately veered towards the lineup that ran between 81 and 84. Because I absolutely adore Discipline. This is where I came in. I mean, 81 was even too early for me at that stage. I was 8 in 1981. But this was the King Crimson that I first experienced. And as a guy who really quite exclusively, when I was getting into this kind of music, was listening to straight heavy metal and hard rock, Discipline just blew my mind. It took me quite a while to accept what was going on and just how different to everything else it was that I was listening to at this stage. It was just more a band name that I thought, well, I need to get into King Crimson because I hear so many great things about them. And obviously I knew some tracks from the early stuff. And Discipline just went boom. It just was like, oh wow, okay, there's much more out there than I realised. It's not just verse, chorus, and guys were here up to here. Nothing wrong with that, I may add, but there you go. And that to me was just phenomenal. The other aspect of it as well, it's interesting because a lot in recent weeks, we've spoken about how the giants of prog adapted in the 80s. Now well, they didn't really, did they? They folded in certain ways, whether they disappeared or whether they folded and gave in and became a chart band. So, completely changed what they were all about, the whole ethos of the band. I mean, we've given Genesis a kicking in recent times. Eras of Rush have had a hard time. I kind of was an outlier on that show too. Sorry. Tull came off a little bit better, but there are albums that we speak about from that era too that are not great. King Crimson avoid that. They completely avoid that. They do something completely different while sounding remarkably current for that time. And that is, even with 40 years of hindsight, is really impressive. They sounded you know, all of the 80s, they were trying new things, they were using new technology, they were kind of incorporating what the other prog bands were doing, but ended up in a completely different place. They just eschewed all of that. We're not going to do any of that. And if anything, they managed to hit a point where they were accessible and challenging. It's arguably more song-based, but less verse chorus. It's a real juxtaposition between what the 80s were about and then where they came from. So for me, it's the lineup of Fripp, Adrian Belew, Tony Levin, and Bill Bruford that stands out for me. It's the lineup I always go back to. And even though I don't have an awful lot of live albums, there are a couple of live albums where they also incorporate earlier music into that set, and they do it individually while still being very reverential of what had come before. And I like that too. I don't want a band like King Crimson to go out with a lineup that just goes, here's the hits, we're going to play them exactly as they were, and this is what we do, and it's going to sound completely different. The set is completely cohesive on albums like I think it's Absent Lovers. That just works for me as well. So that's the lineup that I go for. There you go, that's my choice.
I'd argue too that Mr. Fripp really loved that lineup too, because I think a lot of the ones that came after that were kind of a variation of that lineup, so to speak. Whereas in the 70s, every lineup was completely different than the one before it. So, yeah.
Did any of you guys see the Discipline band?
Yeah.
I saw them. I was still living in New York. I saw them at the Savoy. I saw 5 out of 6 shows at the Savoy, and then I saw them at Pier 84. I saw them a lot, and it was they were an incredible band, and it kind of goes back to what I was saying. They still, there was an element of improv. I mean, they were got to the point where really what Stephen was saying. I mean, it was always a very forward-thinking band. They were both playing. Fripp was playing the Roland guitar synthesizer, which was kind of unusual for him. You expect him to play the Gibson, the Black Gibson, and there was they were Belew played percussion. So you had Bruford and Belew both playing percussion at times. It was an exceptional band. The only bad part was that the only old tunes they would play Red, and they play Lockstone Part 2, and that was it. It was like people would be screaming for Schizoid Man. They just didn't do it.
They did that in the 90s.
It was like
Songs they played on the 95 tour.
Hey, it goes back to what I was saying. I mean, here it is. He brought King Crimson back in this kind of crazy lineup. He had, Paul Simon's bass player, and but they were a monumental band. They were doing that Discipline album is an amazing album. They're doing like gamelan. It's like gamelan music. Who was doing that? Nobody was doing that. I mean, a lot of it, and I'll get crucified for saying this because I know a lot of prog guys are not into the band, but there's a lot of talking heads.
Oh, absolutely.
That Remain in Light, and that. I mean, it's without some of those Talking Heads albums, there probably wouldn't have been a Discipline, and Adrian Belew brought over a lot of that, from his recordings with them. But very, very, who was doing that? Nobody, really nobody.
I agree.
I'll shut up.
I agree. Yeah, Discipline's great. That was my first King Crimson album that I ever bought. And I worked my way back.
Yeah, that was where I was.
Yeah.
Nice sounding album too, by the way.
Yeah, it's
very
amazing album.
Sheltering Sky. Put the Sheltering Sky on with the lights out.
Oh man.
It's awesome. You get lost in that.
Oh yeah.
But that actually, that kind of goes back to what I was saying. When they would do Sheltering Sky live, they would stretch that out. There was a lot of improv going on in that. Fripp was never really playing the same thing. And I would see it night after night. It was always a little different.
It's different. Yeah. Gotta love that.
Yeah.
All right, Lewis, what do you got?
You're on mute, buddy.
Thank God.
I think
Someone's got the olds.
it's another. I got them, and they're fucking bad. I was thinking very hard about this assignment. I thought it was incredibly hard, actually, because I think that it's very easy to just say, well, can you really make an album that sounds better than Lark's or Red?
Mhm.
Right?
Mhm.
But then, if you think about it a little closer and you actually dissect the music, and then you remember how you felt when you first heard it, and how you still think about those records. I didn't come into the picture with certainly Red or those records. I came in with Discipline, and Discipline was an explosion of sound, unlike anything that I had ever heard before. That was not like anything that was being played at that time.
Mhm.
And it was certainly not a band that was played in Mexican radio. Okay, that was nothing like that on the radio ever. So you already were a pariah of society just for listening to that. And I absolutely loved the fact that it was so mathematical and geometrical and nerdy, but without that being the point of it.
Mhm.
In other words, I think that with that lineup, it really was a perfect storm, because as much as I love John Wetton and the fact he's a brilliant singer, he's no Tony Levin.
Mhm.
Okay. And Bill Bruford was still there. So that only served to elevate the rhythm section, which is kind of crazy to say, but it was just better. And then on top of that, you had an additional world-class musician in Adrian Belew.
Mhm.
Because from my perspective, if you're good enough to play with Zappa, everybody else needs to shut the fuck up and listen.
Yep.
Right?
Mhm.
So you have Adrian Belew on top of that rhythm section, and he's singing, and then Fripp is layering his craziness on it. And I think that I can't honestly say that there is, even though Red is an album that when I first heard it, it made sense to me intuitively, right? It had the sound of the street. There was an anger to it, and it made sense in a way that Yes could never make sense to me and never will, right? It's just not my vibe, right? But the King Crimson stuff, yeah, that anger was there, but that anger was still in those records, right?
Mhm.
And in the records of the 80s, they still played with a lot of explosion, but it was like a nuclear reactor. There were control rods.
Mhm.
It wasn't as randomly wild as some of the stuff in the 70s, but it had, at any moment, you had the sense that it could just detonate, right? So really, I think that name Discipline is very, very key to what they were trying to achieve.
Mhm.
He was trying to use what they had done before without repeating it. And the easiest thing is to do what he ended up doing. But even then, he didn't do it quite like that. It was just to play the hits, right? I mean, The Who has been doing that for I don't know how many decades, right?
We'll be
And I
doing
love
it
The
soon
Who.
too.
Yeah.
But the two, yeah. But I think that what they did with those records is really one of a kind. I mean, there's a reason why I have this. These are all the transcriptions of those three records. This is, the way people read novels. I spend my day reading these things, right? I'm reading the sheet music because it's even though I've heard these records, I don't even know how many times, I still learn from them. And I am just a sucker for it. Tony Levin, like Ron Carter, understands that the main job of the bass player is to pick the right note at the right time.
Mhm.
That's your function, right? And I just love these records. So even though I think that I have never enjoyed a live concert as much by King Crimson as I did the later ones with the three drummers and that super polished live unit,
Mhm.
this is my favorite. The Belew, Levin, Bruford, and Fripp. You can't beat it. Even though, of course, Larks and Red are monumental records, right? They're indispensable to anybody who has any kind of logic. But I think that these are the records. Yeah, come on, that is this perfect record, right? But as a musician and as a music fan, this era impresses me even more. And later, you know, when they did the other stuff, the Construction of Light and those things, level 5, I mean, it is a hyper nerd version of this. I mean, some of those songs are level 5. That is not easy to play, right? Forget it. But then again, neither is Fracture. Okay, so I'm just saying every era, you know, has had some brilliant stuff, but this is the one that's near. This is my favorite. Right?
That's what it all comes down to, right? Yep.
So yeah, that's even though I never saw them live, I've seen all the videos. I own a bunch of the live records, but to me, this is the one that I resonate with the most.
All right, cool.
You know, and you know, people tend to underrate Beat and Three: A Perfect Pair. Those are phenomenal albums as well. You know, I don't think that there's a drop off at any stage. Just like what we mentioned before. When it comes to King Crimson, I just think that they just happen to be the great, you know, what we would call like the definitive progressive rock band. There really wasn't anything, at least during this period, that I really disliked from them. You know.
And what Steven said is really key. These guys didn't only not suck in the 80s, they reinvented themselves incredibly successfully. They delivered the goods, right?
Yep.
There's no suckage here.
Originally, the band was going to be called Discipline.
Yep.
When they first started playing, they were,
and it is different enough that maybe that made sense. But in a way, I'm glad they didn't change the name, because then that created an even bigger myth. King Crimson, the entity that morphs and pushes ahead.
All throughout, yep, all throughout.
And I love that. I absolutely love that. And I think I mentioned this earlier in in the show or in one of our conversations, but even my daughter, who was 13 or so when they came around, we went to see them in Chicago, and her response to seeing that concert was to grab all my King Crimson CDs and lock herself in a room and listen to them.
Nice.
She just wanted to see what the hell was happening. Like, she wanted make up her own mind, but she had realized that this was something different. This was like something really powerful had just happened.
That's a smart kid right there.
So
taught her well.
I was, you know, and yeah, it was a very powerful show. Obviously, I mean, those 3 drums. I mean, how many of us have been in a shitty drum circle? It's terrible, right? But and it's so easy to screw up the multiple drums, right? No, this was perfect. I mean, in discipline. What a thing of beauty. Even the 21st century schizoid man, right? Which you would think, okay, what's going to happen? Well, it turns out that the actual lead is played by Gavin Harrison, and he's doing these crazy melodic fills with his right hand while doing multiple other counterpoints with his left. Then he's doing something with his feet that echoes back to the chorus. It's an amazing thing if you just listen to the drum part without all the other stuff that's happening, right?
Yeah, it's crazy.
So,
right?
I mean, it's good stuff.
Yeah, that show is incredible.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right, so the gentleman who inspired this entire conversation, Mr. Porter, what would you pick as your favorite King Crimson lineup?
Well, I'm glad you picked this topic. I had fun with it just going back. And you guys have said so much. I mean, Ken pointed out, and I feel the same way, there is no bad King Crimson. I feel like they're the true prog band. They've evolved throughout their career, and it's almost like when they get to a certain point, Fripp deconstructs everything, we're done, and builds it back up into something different, right? I mean, there's so many different sounds that came out of those lineups, all under that King Crimson banner. And like what Lewis said, I only saw them 3 times, and it's all been very recent. I saw them in 14, I think 2017, and I saw them this summer. And when I heard they were going to have 3 drummers, I'm like, why? And why would you do that? And I went, and I was absolutely blown away. It was incredible. That was such a powerful band. And then in terms of my favorite lineup, I really struggled with this, even though it was I suggested it to you, Pete, because I like Crimson at full power. I love Ian McDonald's saxes and reeds and everything he plays and brings. I love the violin in that band, but they were never there together, right? I mean, yeah, guest appearances, but if you talk about true lineups, when Cross was there, Collins or McDonald was not technically in the band. And I'm thinking, when you see him live now, you have Collins was there this tour playing. And I'm like, God, I'd love to have had Cross, and I actually like McDonald a little better than Collins, but that's picky. But I'm thinking, geez, they never had the lineup where you had all of that on a studio record. You had guest appearances, but I think for favorite lineup, I've got to go with Starless. To me, it's just Red is my favorite album because it has Ian McDonald, Cross on there with, the trio. And that was my introduction, even though I didn't listen. I had a buddy who introduced me to them. And at the time I was coming out of high school, Maiden, Priest, that's the kind of stuff I was listening to at that point. And he's like, oh, you like the heavy stuff? Here's Red. And it's been my favorite album by them ever since. But I want David Cross in the lineup. So I'm going with the Starless lineup for my favorite King Crimson lineup.
Nice.
And by the way, just to go back to what you said, I did have a chance to see them as a double trio back when I lived in Maryland.
Mhm.
It was a really weird bill that also had Alan Parsons and the double trio. They were phenomenal.
They were great. Mhm. Only
Then
time I saw
I got to see just with Pat and Trey Gunn and Adrian Belew and Robert Fripp a couple of times. The one time was awful because Robert Fripp was just being an ornery prick. And
Was that when he was sitting behind the amps?
That was not quite that. He was sitting sideways facing a rack mount effect thing. And he was unhappy with how it sounded. And he kept signaling to these techs who came and did things. And then it still sounded identical. But then he was satisfied for a few minutes and then he was pissed off again. And it just got in the way. So basically it was Belew trying to hold the sinking boat together. And it was an awful show. They played that in Washington, D.C. It was terrible. Absolutely terrible.
Lewis, I saw League of Crafty Guitarists, I think in 2006 or 2007. Somebody snapped a picture. Fripp told everyone to stand up and they walked off the stage.
Yeah.
Wow.
He pointed in the audience. They removed the guy and he brought them all back out about 5 minutes later. Funniest thing I ever.
Yeah.
That happened at a Philly show too.
Fripp being Fripp.
And,
Yeah.
one time
They did a beheading as an encore.
before the last lineup with the three drums, I saw them. I'll never forget this date. It was 08. They played here in Chicago at the Park West. And I got paralytic drunk with a guy that Chad knows. His name is Matt Lewis.
Never
He
heard of him.
decided he wanted to race me. And and we
That's a bad idea.
it didn't end well for him, but I got really plastered. So all I remember is that show, Fripp was playing from behind the amps.
Oh man.
That was terrible.
Right. And I'm thinking, and that was when they had, and I love Pat Mastelotto. I just love that guy. And I think, with Stickman and other, he's just a phenomenal musician who doesn't get enough credit. But it was just sad to see this guy, like, dude, if you don't want to be there, why are you here? Right? What are you doing? Right? It was very weird to me to see this display. I didn't quite get it. And I may have heckled him because, of course, I was very drunk, but I didn't take a picture. He didn't walk away. And not that he was going to go anywhere because he was already caged behind his amps. Where is he going to go? Right? He's already took himself out of the equation. So I never saw my favorite lineup, but I have to say that Adrian Belew did bring something to that band that is sorely missed. I have, and so did Bill Bruford. I mean, we still got 11, right? That element is present.
Can I interject one thing? Because I saw that lineup a lot also. And it kind of goes, maybe I'll tie in with the least favorite. But one thing about Adrian, I loved Adrian when he played the Strat. and he was
Hmm.
doing all the great animal noises and all the
Yeah.
crazy shit.
Mhm.
Once he put that thing
Elephant
down,
talk.
I mean, I went to a guitar clinic on Long Island once with Adrian,
For the Parker.
and people were just screaming out animals, and he was doing all kinds of animal noise, But once he put the Strat down and he started touring with that Parker Fly
Yes.
guitar, that thing, then Adrian, all the magic was gone. What he did with that Strat was really special. He brought, kind of goes back to, like I was saying with Jamie Muir, that sort of that X factor to King Crimson. He played off of Fripp so well because they were coming at it from totally different directions, and it just worked, the two of them. And when Adrian would just stand in front of the amp and he was just getting all that feedback and stuff and just pounding the shit out of the guitar, he would just beat that Stratocaster to death. It was great. And then later on, you saw him playing that Parker Fly, and that guitar that's a piss poor guitar.
It's a toy.
Yeah.
And then they started messing around with electronics a lot around that time. And then that's, well, I don't want to give too much away, but that's that was for me, one of my least favorite eras because of exactly what you were saying, Ken. I thought that Baloo's playing and what he brought to the table during that period was not as enticing as the earlier stuff. And Fripp was doing all sorts of weird stuff. They were using a lot of weird spacey electronic drum things. I don't know. That's a weird era for me.
Yeah. I saw that tour where Fripp sat behind the amps, and it was like, why are you here? And it was funny because who sits down next to me? Mike Portnoy. And I'm talking to Mike, and Mike says that was the first time he had ever seen King Crimson. And I felt bad. I'm like, you're not really seeing King Crimson. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
First of all, you can't even see Robert. I mean, literally, you can't see him.
That's right. I just saw there was a gap between two amps, and I could see him sitting there.
I couldn't even see that.
But from other parts of the auditorium, you wouldn't see anything.
Yeah.
He was not present.
Snap a picture. What a jerk.
Escorted out.
No picture, but there was hecklage.
All right, my favorite lineup. So this was difficult. And I agree, even though kind of what I said 2 seconds ago, that's more from a live standpoint. I think on album, every lineup has been great in this band's history. So for me, I have a bunch of eras that I just love to death. And it was like, I'm like trying to stack them up next to each other. So I'm like, all right, well, there's the very first lineup, which is very special for a lot of reasons, right? That's the first album. Man, it's just so good, so groundbreaking, but not a band that stuck together very long, not a lot of live recordings available, right? You got the next couple of lineups, which were very brief, very cool and interesting, a little weird, but still really cool. There's some good live stuff available for that. By the way, Stephen, in case I've been going down the King Crimson live rabbit hole. Once you start, there's no end in sight. I must have picked up like 15 live King Crimson CDs over the last year. It's never ending, and I don't have them all. But it's a lot of fun. A lot of fun. It was inevitable. I knew I was going to do it at some point. I love the Discipline Band. Again, that's the band that I came in with. That band was so tight. They were just so early 80s in every way. They were accessible, yet they were so musically challenging. I love the Current incarnation. I've seen the Current band like 3 times, and every time I go see them, they may be no more now from what you hear, but I've been just so completely blown away by their live performance every time I've gone. I've seen the 90s version. I've seen the 2000s version. So I've seen all the more modern ones for the most part. So I have to go back and back to the studio albums and try and figure it out. And I think there's one lineup in my head that I kind of gravitate towards because I've gone down that rabbit hole in recent times where I've purchased all sorts of live albums from all throughout their history. And to me, because every studio lineup is so great, like we've all said, and it's so hard to choose one, through this exercise, I had to say, well, let me think about all these live recordings that I've been listening to recently and over the course of my, listening to this band throughout my life. Which of the live recordings really impresses me the most and really speaks to me the most? And when it came down to it, it was basically the lineup that recorded this, that recorded this, that recorded this, and also I have the big box set that Ken showed as well, that recorded this, that recorded this. I mean, and I have others, this is just some of them. And that's Bruford, Fripp, Wetton, and Cross. Because to me, there was an element of danger about that lineup. The improvs that lineup did were just amazing. And every night, even though I never had a chance to see them, but every recording I've ever listened to, even though a lot of them had the same tracks on them, they're all completely different from night to night. All these improvs sound nothing alike. They title them something different. It's just, but the power that this band portrayed, so heavy and intense. I mean, whatever you want to call it, prog rock. There's like proto metal on some of this stuff. There's jazz and jazz fusion, avant-garde, free jazzes, all this stuff. And you just had these guys that were just, I could just imagine being in the audience of a show on any show on that tour. And probably, Bruford's looking at Fripp, looking at Bruford, looking at Wetton, looking at Cross, and just this wall of sound that just, you never know where they're going to go next. That's, to me, that was the deciding factor. It's like, which band would I have loved to have go seen live based on all the live stuff that I've heard, and the studio stuff is amazing too. And it had to be that lineup. Just had to be that lineup. I always go back to those guys. I really wanted to go for the Discipline bit. That's what my heart was telling me. But then I was like, I don't want to just do that. And then part of me, I love the debut, but I was like, now, which is the one that just impresses me the most, no matter whether I'm listening to anything in the studio or the live stuff, and it's that lineup right there. So,
Yep.
That lineup was not about casual listening. That lineup demanded your attention. And you listen to those albums, like talking about Great Deceiver and all the albums that Pete was showing you. I mean, you listen to them live. You're hearing musicians they're really listening to each other.
Oh yeah.
I mean, those improvs are devastating. They're just unbelievable.
Well, there's the story about the song Trio when they played that, and Bill Bruford just stood there with his arms crossed and his sticks, just waiting for a spot to come in. And he said, "It's going too well. I'm not coming in." And they gave him a songwriting credit for it, for his restraint, which is fantastic.
Admirable restraint, right?
Yep.
Right.
Based on all the recordings I've heard from, that lineup, that to me seems like a band kind of like the Grateful Dead, right? You have these deadheads who would go to every freaking show, travel however far they have to go see every Grateful Dead concert, because they knew every night they were going to get something completely different. That's this lineup for me. If I was old enough at the time, I would have traveled anywhere to go see that lineup.
And it was a travesty. They
I would
never
have
released Dr. D. Dr. D.
Yeah.
That's one of my top 10 King Crimson songs, period.
Yeah. Yep. Good stuff. All right. Well, now for the least favorite. And again, we'll preface this by saying I'm sure none of these lineups suck. It's just, you got to pick one that's maybe not quite doesn't move you as much as some of the other ones. So Chad, back to you.
Yeah, this is hard to pick a least after all that. They're all good. You can just start at the beginning and go down and just look at the lineups, and even like a lesser favorite of mine being like Islands, you look at the personnel on the album. There's great players on the album. You can still get a lot of enjoyment out of it. Clearly, I'm not picking the middle era with the trio and the added musicians, so to speak. And I can't pick the Discipline era. Those guys, those three albums were phenomenal, starting with Discipline and Beat and Three of a Perfect Pair. And as I said before, I really liked Vroom and I liked Thrack, but I think once they lost that double trio, they started to lose some steam. So for me, I went back and I listened to Construction of Light. I listened to Power to Believe, the EPs. I think Level 5 is great. Happy to Be Happy With is pretty cool. But I really was a little bit disillusioned when I went back to that quartet and listened to Construction of Light. There's a couple of highlights there, but I think they lost their way a bit. I know Fripp was not as thrilled with that album. He felt they were going through the motions a little bit. There wasn't as much power and excitement to it. And I would agree with him. I think songs like Prozac Blues, I don't like that one at all.
I don't either.
Construction of Light, I think, is better on Level 5 than it is on the album. Parts of Lark's Tongues Part 4 are good. Some of them are not as good. Level 5, I believe, actually is Lark's Tongues Part 5, and I think that's quite good. So I think they got their mojo back when they did that EP. But for me, the Construction of Light is their low point. So I would have to pick that lineup, unfortunately, even though all four guys are great. Fripp, Ballou, Mastelotto, and Gunn. I mean, you're not going to find a bad player in King Crimson across 50 years. I mean, and I'm not going to pick the latest lineup too. They're phenomenal. They haven't done a lot of, I know they haven't put a studio album out, but if you see them live, you're going to be blown away. But I'm going to have to go with the quartet after the, or shall we call them the double trio, or the double duo, I guess they called themselves at one point. So I would have to go with the Construction of Light lineup, even though they redeemed themselves with the Power to Believe, in my opinion. Some good, powerful stuff in there, but as Pete alluded to before, they got a little too maybe industrial and a little too electronic at times. Yeah, I think that is my choice, is that last quartet out of all of the lineups across the board.
Before I forgot to name Anthony's favorite lineup. That is actually his favorite lineup. So the Power to Believe lineup with Fripp, Ballou, Mastelotto, and Gunn.
Man, he's wrong again.
Ballou. He's keeping the streak alive.
Well, you know what it is, and Andy's not here to talk about it, but he is a massive Ballou fan.
Yes.
And I think those two albums are very Ballou influenced. I think he plays a big role in those albums. And so I kind of understand that.
Yeah, I think that's part of my issue with the later ones. Some of the lyrics, especially on Construction of Light, get a little too wacky and out there. Ballou's always been a little weird, which is fine, and it's been great. I mean, things like Elephant Talk, I mean, that's not a normal song, but it's phenomenal. But things like Prozac Blues and parts of Construction of Light, I'm like, yeah, I think he could have worked a little bit longer in those lyrics and maybe not put the vocal effects on Prozac Blues. And I don't know, I just felt there were some strange choices on that album. So, teach his own.
All right, cool. Ken.
Can we agree that Prozac Blues is the worst song King Crimson ever recorded?
Yep.
Yeah.
And it's an opener, which makes it even harder. Right out of the gate, you're like, oh.
Makes me sick.
In a way,
You feel, Chuck.
Tell us how you really feel, Chuck. Woo!
Oh, man.
I hear that, I want to hurl.
it's very defiant to start a record like that.
I'm gonna pretty much mirror what Chad said. There over the years there's been aspects of the band that kind of wore out its welcome with me. When Bruford was heavily into like the electric drums, I kind of got tired of that. It was novel for its time, but I had enough of that. It's, for me, Construction of Light and Power to Believe, those two albums. At that point, the band had kind of wore out its welcome for me. As I said, Adrian wasn't doing all the really cool, crazy shit on guitar. It's hard. I'd be hard pressed, I guess, to call those albums as commercial, because they're not really. They're not commercial. But as songs, they just don't hold up for me. I just don't find them involving or particularly interesting. Again, I'm happy to listen to them and maybe and maybe even reevaluate my opinion of them. But they just there's aspects of them which certainly are good. And as I said, initially, there's no bad King Crimson. But if you look at the canon, the overall work, those two albums, for me, they were kind of running on fumes a little bit. And there was just some magic that was gone. They were kind of going through the motions a little bit, I think.
But Ken, isn't the world your oyster soup kitchen floor wax museum? Haven't you said that before?
Oh, sure. Great album title, but great song title. But yeah, I and the thing is, like, I really like what Trey Gunn brought to the band. Yeah. But I also kind of miss Tony Levin. I mean, it was kind of cool what Trey was doing was a lot of what Robert used to do. I mean, he could have easily covered a lot of Robert's parts on the war guitar. And when you listen to it, sometimes I used to find it a little difficult to figure out who was who. But yeah,
Ken, I always thought that it'd be kind of cool to sit at a mixing board and be able to bring things up and down and actually hear, oh, that's what Gunn's doing, that's what Levin's doing, that's what, like, just to be able to have something where you could do that, because there's a lot going on.
Well, that's the thing with, like, the Chapman stick and the war guitar. You forget that a lot of people think of them as purely like a bass, sort of like a bass or something. But the leads that you could play on that thing are just crazy.
It's a tap board.
We were going back, I don't remember which show we were doing where I was talking about Gordian Knot. And, some of the stuff that Sean Malone was playing on the stick, the leads he was playing, you would think it was like Ron Jarzombek. In fact, I had a hard time trying to figure out, I wasn't in the room, so I had a hard time figuring out who was who. So it kind of goes back to what Trey was doing with the war guitar. Sure, he was playing bass, the bass parts, but he was playing some really killer leads on that record. But yeah, there's maybe in like an industrial quality is something that you would attribute to those two albums. And yeah, there was like a little roughness, and it was just kind of, and Adrian brought this weird element to it where he was sort of trying to bring this sort of pop element to it that it just didn't work for me, with the material. So again, better than most bands, but by King Crimson standards, it was a bit of a letdown for me.
Yeah, I hear it. All right, Chuck.
All right. Well, before I third on the Construction Life Power to Believe lineup, I just wanted to make note of one of the more disappointing lineups was the lineup of Lizard. People would say when you look at that album, and so it's a great album. Don't get me wrong. I love the album. Like I said, during that period, I know that Lewis's favorite guy, John Anderson, sings on one track on there, the title track, that is. But when you have a drummer of the status of Andy McCullough, underrated drummer, they Fripp had wanted him to play like Michael Giles. But if you've ever heard Andy McCullough play the drums, he was as good, if not better, than Bruford at that time. This guy was that good, But they reined him in, and then you could barely hear his drumming. It sounded like he was playing feathers on a stick, on like a piece of paper or something on the album, and it just really disappointed me. Gordon Haskell, which I really haven't heard much from him. Which he passed away in 2020. His vocals were a little weak there. His bass playing was somewhat okay, but I always felt that was a weak lineup for me. But yes, but getting back to the Construction of Light, the Power to Believe lineup, to me that lineup was just too sterile in comparison to everything that came afterwards and everything that came before. Great musicians, but that stuff was just sterile. I didn't find anything to be organic or flowing like the way it did. It just seemed like they just went inside, they played the music, and they just played it, and they were like, okay, everybody will get over this, and they'll like this. But to me, it just felt like as good as most of the stuff was on there, because I think that the Power to Believe is a far superior album to Construction of Light, but it just was a clinical lineup. So that was my take on that. That might have been my least favorite of the bands, of the band's incarnations. It's that lineup. I'm just talking about the studio wise. So that's what I believe.
I was surprised that they went back and re-released that as the Reconstruction of Life. I mean, I know, like I said before, that Fripp was disappointed with it, but I personally never heard the remix or the redo of it. Does anybody have any opinion on that? Have anybody heard the Reconstruction of Life?
I didn't even know that existed.
Yeah, I didn't know either.
Yeah, I've never heard it. And then they went up and released that Heaven and Earth box set of the last era, which I don't know how many CDs that was. I'm sure it was somewhere between 15 and 50. But certainly not one of the box sets that I would have considered buying from this band. All the other ones, absolutely. But this one never even crossed my mind.
All right, Stephen.
Well, I just want to emphasize that we haven't, put this together to annoy absent friends who happen to have chosen this lineup as their favorite. Because I'm going to go to the same place here. As I said when we were talking about favorite lineups, I experienced this band as a studio band. And I'll maybe go a step further than certainly Ken has with it, and say this is the Crimson album that I borderline don't like. Okay, I put it on last night thinking, I must be wrong. This is Crimson. This is King Crimson. They don't do albums that you think about. They just don't do that. I didn't get to the end of the Construction of Light. I just didn't.
Jeez, I'm surprised you made it through the first song, man.
Well, I knew what was coming with the first song, so I thought you've got to plow on beyond that. And still literally halfway through, I thought,
Dr. D never gets released. Prozac Blues does.
So I'm in exactly the same place. The thing for me is you can draw parallels with the lineup that had preceded it. My favorite lineup. You can draw parallels. There are similarities in some of the structures. There are similarities in some of the way that they approach the music. As a guy who's listening just for pleasure, I'm never going to be talented enough to play along or anything like that. There's no payoff. That's the difference, is there's no reward for your patience. There's nothing there that kind of says, this is the reason that we constructed this. It seems to be, I think as Ken said, it's an exercise as much as anything else. And I struggle with that because I need a reason to kind of say, that's why I'm hanging my hat on this song. That's why I'm going to come back and listen to this one again. And it just, for me, struggles to really ever present that. And it's almost like it doesn't want to. I actually think there's more going on in these albums, but they've got less to say. They don't really have a clear voice. The Power to Believe is much better, much better. I mean, it's night and day, it's by a distance, but I still don't reach for it very often. But if I did, I can get to the end. And that's a key difference. But yeah, I mean, some of the stuff with the Heaven and Earth, I've listened to bits and some of that's quite good too. That can be no all down with any lineup of King Crimson, but at the point that they did the Construction of Light, I'm struggling to stay on board, and I'm struggling to maintain interest, and therefore by a distance. And one of my other issues with the lineup of Fripp, Ballou, Gunn, and Master Lotto, who are all massively talented, is that there are so many little offshoots, so many little solo projects, so many albums where one is on them, but there's a whole lot of different guys, and they seem to be hung up on this sound. They seem to want to come back and almost kind of say, actually, we can do it right. And I still don't think that any of them really have. There are so many albums that Gunn's been involved with, you think, okay, this is where we're heading, and it just kind of treads the same water for me. And it just loses my interest in that sense. So yeah, I'm going with a crowd on this one. It's Fripp, Baloo, Gunt, and Master Lotto for me. Very talented guys. Not a lineup that I've got much love for.
Do any of you guys like those project albums?
Yeah, I really like the Project 3, the Space Groove. I think the one disc of that, actually both of them, but one of the discs is better than the other one. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah,
They have their moments. I very rarely listen to them though.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they didn't do a lot for me. I remember seeing in Philly, I think it was I don't know, Chad, if you were there, it was at the Bellevue Hotel.
I did not go to that. Isn't that the one where Fripp walked off?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
Well, he walked off at the end.
Right.
It was Fripp, Trey Gunn, and I think Adrian Ballou, and Ballou was playing an electric drum kit. I don't want to see Adrian play an electric drum. I don't want to see him play drums, let alone an electric one.
He did start on drums, Ken, I think, before he was a guitar player.
No, it's not that I said he's a bad
I
drummer,
know.
but I'd rather see him play electric drums than that shitty Parker Fly.
Parker Fly.
But that wasn't. I mean, it was sort of interesting. Yeah, and Fripp got pissed off at the end because somebody took a photograph or something like
There you
that.
go.
Jesus
And
Christ. Why don't they just throw it at him?
Actually, in fact, he was kind of a dick about it because they kind of stood there for like an encore, and he stood there and then he kind of shook his head and walked off, like he was going to do it, but it was like he was giving the audience the middle finger.
Oh,
He ended up putting that out on a recording. I forget which one. It's probably one of the collectors, the DG collectors discs. But they ended up putting that thing out somewhere, so you can hear that whole fiasco at the end. It's pretty
I
funny.
didn't see the purpose of doing all of those albums, doing those projects. Just do another King Crimson album,
Well, that's Fripp and his experimentation, and that's what they call the fragmentation of Crimson or whatever. I don't know. I thought they were kind of neat. I understand what you mean, though. Sort of like unnecessary, but I enjoyed them to an extent.
There are certain artists who a refusal to conform becomes a habit. Once you've kind of set your stall out to say, I'm not going to do what people want and what people expect, it's difficult to backtrack. And I think that Fripp got himself in a position at certain points where that was where he was headed. I'm not going to do what you want. I'm not going to do what people tell me. This is what you're going to get. And you're going to like it.
Well, look at him now. He puts on makeup and plays cover songs in his kitchen with his wife.
I love it. I
He's
absolutely.
having a great
So do I,
time.
man. So do I.
He kind of holds himself to a very high standard, and that's great. But you just don't have to be a douche nozzle about it,
Mhm.
Did you
No,
see,
it's,
have you guys seen the trailer for the new documentary where there's one little clip in there? He says, "I think this is the first lineup of the band where someone in the band doesn't resent my utter presence."
Wow.
Wonder why.
Mhm.
The best was in Bill Bruford's autobiography, where he talks about one chapter is called "What's it like playing with Robert Fripp," and then he talks about how Fripp didn't even know Bill's kids' names.
Right.
By the way, if you've never read Bill's autobiography,
It's
that's a
amazing,
must
man.
read.
It's
That
amazing.
is
Mhm.
unbelievable.
Yeah,
He's a
it's
funny guy. He's a good writer. Yep. That's awesome, Buck.
Yeah.
And Lewis.
All right. So two things. Number one, I think that this was a hard part for me, which was my least favorite, right? And I think there's a difference between my least favorite record and my least favorite lineup, and yet there isn't in this way. I think The Power to Believe is actually pretty good. I actually like that record a lot. The Construction of Light, I have to admit, is a record that when I came out, I bought it and I listened to it and I listened to it and I listened to it because my brain could just couldn't compute the fact that it sucked. And I wanted to love it.
It starts off shitty, man.
But it kicks you in the balls from the very first song. And it's kind of hard to recover after that. However, in more recent times, when I had the good fortune of seeing the current or the last, whatever it is, King Crimson lineup, when they play some of that material from that era, it really, really comes alive. I think, and this is not a slam on Trey Gunn, who's not only a fabulous musician, but a great guy. I really like him. He's been super nice to me whenever we've talked. He's a very, very nice guy. And we've even played a couple of shows together in different bands, of course. I've never played in a band with him, but he's just a super nice guy. And I just find that group suffered because there wasn't like it became Robert Fripp and Adrian Belew locking horns. Mm-hmm. And the other guys were too junior to really fucking have a say, the way that a Bill Bruford would have had a say, or a Tony Levin or somebody else. And that is why it began this strange, to me, and I'm not saying that's why they did it, but to me, all these projects, they sound like, to go back to the beginning of this show with Chad, which one is Pink? Mm-hmm. Who's really who really is the heart and soul of this beast, right? Like who's got it by the balls? Let's see who's really the guy, right? And I'm gonna go ahead and play drums because I used to play drums, and why the fuck not? And I'm gonna do this. And I even once saw Robert Fripp do a solo show opening for, believe it or not, Godspeed You Black Emperor.
Oh, nice. Mm-hmm.
It was a very weird pairing because Mr. Fripp came out and he looked like he had found a turd in his soup. He was not happy, and he just played. And the people who were at the club were all Godspeed fans. They had no idea who this weird guy was sitting there making these electronic beeps and sounds and things. And nobody took pictures. But I'll never forget this. There was this wafting sound, and as it was dying down, somebody who was not me, I swear it wasn't me, yelled, "You suck!" And that was the only the Fripp turned around and smiled. He didn't leave in a huff or nothing. He continued to make those sounds for another 20 minutes. And so that was when I realized there's more to this guy than meets the eye, right? Mm-hmm. Which is why I love all those videos with Toya and all that silliness. Mm-hmm. They do not in any way offend me. They show me other things about the guy that I really appreciate are there, right? But so those songs are really good. And also, I never really liked a lot of the stuff on Islands. I don't need to hear cat food. I just don't, right? But when you hear Islands performed by the current band, or the one that, again, it's a different thing. Mm-hmm. So much better, right? So, I guess I would have to agree, though, that my least favorite lineup has to be the Fripp, Belew, Mastalotto, and Trey Gunn, but not as a knock to those two guys who I know both of them. I've recorded with Pat. He's a great guy too. Great people, great people. But they had no way to really confront the egos of Fripp and Belew. There was no counterbalance, right? Mm-hmm. And by far one of the worst concerts I've ever seen in my life was played by those four guys, and it was all because of Robert Fripp. Right? Because he was just not happy to be there. I don't even know why the fuck he toured. Mm-hmm. I don't think he needs the money. Maybe he does. I don't know. I'm not living his life, but he doesn't seem to have a drug habit.
Hey, those aftermarkets don't come cheap, let me tell you.
I guess, right? I don't know why he was doing it at the time, but yeah, I would have to say that's my least favorite also, but only because I don't think it was directionless in a sadder way. I think they were just not agreeing what was King Crimson anymore, right? And as a singer, Adrian Belew has a lot of power, right? And as he stayed longer and longer, he felt like it was more his jam, right? It was more his gig. I think that probably caused some friction. I don't know this for a fact, But I just think that it became a problem, and it affected the sound of the music, and I really don't like it. And the show was awful, just awful, absolutely terrible.
All right, Eric.
Well, I do, I have a quick message for Ken from Anthony. And he said, tell Ken I miss her a lot. So
Wow.
I don't, that's between you and Anthony. So we'll go from there.
Oh, I've got something for Anthony. Here you go.
Oh.
It's getting to that point, isn't it?
Anthony, me love you long time.
Oh man. Oh.
So I don't know about you guys, but when I got introduced to Crimson, I did like Red right out of the gate. But there's definitely some King Crimson over the years, as you know, you've all talked about whatever album you started with, you kind of work your way back, or you know, everything. And there were albums such as this. Sorry, Chuck. That was a tough one for me. And I'll align myself with Chuck that Lizard was also a tough one for me. When I first heard it, it took a while. I do like them now. So in the 70s era, Islands is probably my least favorite. And then Discipline, for some reason, that connected with me right away. I love those three records and that lineup. And as you guys said, with Construction of Light, that's probably also what I find to be the weakest of that last lineup. But it's hard, you know, if we're talking about lineups versus the music that they created, that's kind of where I'm torn, because to me, Islands just has never done it for me. But I love Mel Collins. I don't like Boz. I don't like the singing on that record. But Construction of Light, you know, I have to kind of go with the majority. It's probably the album that's done the least for me. So I would go with that lineup of Mastelotto, Gun, Fripp, and Blue as being my least favorite.
All right, so I guess it's left up to me to be unanimous. No, I mean, this was hard for me as well, because again, I'm looking at it from, all right, we got the studio albums, they are what they are. And then, you know, for most of the career of this band, you have a wealth of live material. Now, my initial gut was to pick the Lizard lineup. I really like the album. It's a weird album, but it's like their jazz album, like Ken mentioned early on. And I think that if we were to go back 30, 35, 40 years, I would have easily said Lizard, but I've grown to really love Lizard a lot. Even though that was such a brief lineup of the band, right? And it really, to me, never felt like a solidified lineup of King Crimson. That was kind of like they got together, did the album, and that was kind of that. It's kind of easy to pick on the Boz lineup, because Boz Burrell in no shape or form is a good singer. But I really like that lineup, and I love Islands. I really do.
Some really good songs on that album.
There's amazing songs on it. And I will agree with Lewis, when they play stuff from those two albums in the current band, fucking great.
Yep.
Really good.
Even Lizard.
And it makes you appreciate those albums and those songs even more here in the current band.
No John Anderson.
No John Anderson, right?
Sorry, Ed.
So I go back. So then I'm left. All right. So kind of along the lines with everybody else. So I've seen the 4-piece Fripp, Trey Gunn, Mastelotto, and Ballou. Seen them a couple times. My impression, seeing them live, and even listening to live recordings of them, I don't think those four guys really like playing together all that much. I never got the impression that was a solidified band. And I really I like the stuff from the albums. Power to Believe is a good album. Construction of Light has a couple good moments. For the most part, it's pretty weak. But when I see them live, way too much, I love the improvs, but those guys were dabbling with all sorts of electronic stuff that never really sat well with me. That's kind of what I was getting at before. And I picked up a couple of live recordings recently of that lineup, and it just brought me back to going to see them live and thinking, yeah, not really digging it all that much. Not really digging it. I like the improvs when you got all the guys doing, telepathically doing all this stuff. But when you got, Fripp going on, 8 minutes of weird blippy noises coming out of, whatever he's playing, and Baloo making all this unnecessary stuff, and you got the electronic, it just doesn't work for me. Electronic drums and all this kind of stuff. And I don't think that lineup worked as well together as so many of these other lineups. Great musicians, like everybody has said. I mean, all four of those dudes are amazing musicians. I love Trey Gunn. I've listened to a lot of his solo stuff. He's amazing. Mastelato is a great drummer.
He's
love him.
amazing.
But together, those four just don't really work all that well for me. And I think, when it comes down to it, even though, this was a really short-lived lineup, and maybe it's a weird time in the band and it's really jazzy, it's kind of the outlier in the catalog, I still think these are all really good players, and I think the songs are pretty good, and I think that the songs are magical on Island, and I'm going to go with the Construction of Life, Power to Believe lineup as well. Great musicians, but just yeah, I mean, sorry, Anthony, but it's just
So it's unanimous, right?
It's unanimous. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, other than Anthony's pick.
Other than Anthony, because Anthony actually picked this lineup. He says, with the exception of the song that John Anderson sings, he does not like this lineup.
Well, Anthony doesn't appreciate jazz really, and that's a jazz. That is it. It's a jazz record as you listen to it. I really like what Steven Wilson did with that album. I like his remix of that a lot, and obviously Fripp did it as well.
Much needed, actually, a much needed remastering of it.
Yeah, not remastering, remixing. He remixed that album, and he wiped away all the schmutz. And,
he gave Andy McCullough presents. Sheesh,
buy that. Agree? Do we agree though that we all approve of this lineup?
There are two things about that I really like.
I know what they are.
Yeah, same here.
The Gibson Les Paul and Robert's little mini Mohawk, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, the vintage wood, drying rack. That's what I was looking for.
Yes. Right. All right, real quick. So everybody name a musician you would have loved to have seen in a King Crimson lineup at some point during their career. Chad, what do you got?
Okay, I thought about this and for a couple days, and then it popped in my head, thinking about all these different lineups, how experimental they are, how many different sort of instruments and sounds they've had over the years. I went with a guy who's a little newer, not that new, but newer, and I'm going to go with Mr. Mike Keneally.
I knew you were going to say that.
I knew you might know I'd do that. So I just have always thought that Mike is a great player. He's a classically trained piano player. He learned guitar later in his life, but he's a phenomenal guitar player. He's a good singer. He can play everything from pop to metal to avant-garde, just weird, off the wall. I listened to Scambach 1 and 2 in the last 2 days, and those are just whacked records.
Yep. Hey, Chad, I just saw a post. He joined that project.
Yeah. I'm going to go see that in Sellersville, PA in April. Okay. They're playing on Easter of all things here, but yeah, I'm going to go see that. But yeah, I just think Mike would have added a really cool aspect, a little bit of a twist as far as he's coming. I mean, he came from Zappa from a different standpoint. He was a stunt guitarist, but he also moved into his own solo material where he was doing melodic, he was doing avant-garde. He's gone off and done like the Death Clock things, doing metal. But if you listen to his solo catalog, it runs that range from pop to avant-garde to metal to whatever. And I think anything that they wanted to do, he could contribute to it. He could bring to it. He could morph it, and I think he would work well within that that kind of big umbrella that Bill Bruford always wanted to join. You know, that you could do anything you want under that umbrella of King Crimson. I think Keneally's breadth of talent would have brought a nice spark to the King Crimson catalog. So that's my pick, Mr. Mike Keneally.
You know why? Also, because he would bring to the table a lot of the same things that Ballou and Jocko bring to the table. This kind of, you know, superior guitar skills, but also this love for pop music and the Beatles and that kind of quirky songwriting style. He would have been a perfect fit. Absolutely.
Yeah, and he's got that added, you know, the added keyboard thing. Like if they wanted to go off and do something on the keyboard, while Fripp's playing guitar or whatever, and like you say, like the vocals. Yeah, I just think he would have been a pretty cool addition to them in their later years, and maybe given them an extra spark, and we may have avoided the construction of life.
Yeah, cool.
Good choice. Yeah.
Good choice. Ken.
This was very difficult for me. I gave this a lot of thought, and nobody really jumped out at first, because this is what I said before. Robert could play with whoever he wanted to play with. So, you know, all he had to do was pick up the phone and he'd play with them. One guy that came to mind was Marco Miniman. I think I mean, he's an octopus as a drummer. He's a phenomenal drummer. But Marco also plays guitar. He's a multi-instrumentalist. And there was a chemistry with Bruford and Fripp. You know, there was that tension. And I think that Marco is such a superior drummer that he would have brought that element to the band. He would have pushed Robert, in the way that Bruford did. That was one person I thought. It was funny. I was discussing with one of my friends. I'll name drop him, my longtime friend Seth Baker, cardiologist extraordinaire, and he suggested Percy Jones, which I thought was kind of an interesting choice, because Percy playing the fretless and can't read music, and doesn't read music. That would have brought somebody like Percy in a version of King Crimson. I think would have been interesting.
Remember, they played together on Brian Eno. With Brian Eno.
Well, but did they play together? I mean, they worked together. I mean, they were both on the same album and on the same tracks, but that's a little different than, going into the studio, composing and playing, you know what I mean? And being in the same room together. I mean, anybody can just mail tapes around, right? And there was one other crazy thing I wanted to throw out. And I did actually want to ask Pete, is there any chance that Robert actually watches Sea of Tranquility? Do you have any idea?
No, I
never gotten any feedback. What about Sid Smith?
But Jocko's been on the show,
Sid,
so who knows?
What about Sid Smith? Do you know if Sid watches this? Has ever watched this? So all right, so I'm going to throw out something that if you're watching this, maybe you could finally address this after many years. Or Sid, if you're watching this, maybe you could ask Robert. Or anybody else who's connected to Robert, if you could ask. I saw Robert do Frippatronics. It was at the Kitchen. I believe it was 1979. And during the questions and answers, Robert likes to talk, in between. And Robert talked about working on an album with Max Roach, drummer Max Roach.
Wow.
And yeah, nothing has ever come out of it. I've never heard it mentioned again. Maybe it was an abject failure. I don't know. At the time, I was like, who the hell is Max Roach?
Wow.
But it was 1970. I was 20 years old and I didn't know. And I always thought that would have been something to hear. And if it exists, I'd like to hear it. So if you're out there, Robert, let us know. Spill the beans. Whatever happened to that?
Or anybody watching who has any ideas, heard about it?
Yeah.
Has any
ask? Yeah. Knock on Robert's door and ask.
Don't take a picture.
Yeah, but lunch with him and Toya.
Robert doesn't need another guitar player. It was great. And that's the thing. I love what Adrian did when Adrian was, doing his crazy nutty stuff on the Strat. But other than that, I mean, why does he need another guitar player? So that's why I was having a hard time with this. I don't think King Crimson needed a keyboard player. They didn't need a Keith
Thank
Emerson or anything like that. That would, there
There you go. There you go.
There you go. So I struggled with it, but I thought Marco would have been somebody that would have really pushed Robert. I think he's that talented. That's what I got.
I would agree. Cool. Chuck?
Man, to play with Max Roach, my goodness, you're talking about one of the greatest percussionists ever.
Yeah.
What's it? So, for him to have dreamt of doing that, and so, that would have been amazing. I think it probably would have reined him in, probably, if you'd have thought about it. And just going back to something that just surprised me, that when I found out about this probably a few months ago, that when Fripp had dissolved King Crimson after the 1974, he had mentioned that he was so fed up with the politics of music and so forth, that he was actually thinking about giving the band to Steve Hackett, in that time. And so I didn't think that Steve Hackett was anywhere near the level that he is now. But from friends, I do know that he was never really that much enamored with Genesis in the first place. But I was surprised that he actually mentioned Steve Hackett as the guy that he wanted to give King Crimson to. If you look it up, you'll see it. And I was very shocked by that, because I could never see Steve Hackett, especially the way he was in the 70s, ever playing with King Crimson, or even taking King Crimson into the direction that King Crimson was. But that's one of the guys that I always kind of always wondered how he would play with, if he ever played with King Crimson, Steve Hackett. It would been very strange.
Yeah, strange but intriguing.
It would have been.
Yeah.
Well, you think of what he did later on, when a song like "Mechanical Bride,"
Mm-hmm.
which
Yes.
goes way back to the first Crimson album.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yep. Cool. Stephen?
Well, I found this to be the most difficult part of this whole show, because, as has been mentioned, the whole kind of ethos of the band revolves around Fripp. You need someone that can actually add something to that, or can challenge that. Where I immediately went was a little bit of a cheat, because I would, as Eric had mentioned, I would really like to have had more Ian MacDonald in general throughout the catalogue, because I really like his playing, I really like his style, I like his songwriting. He adds a melancholy, even when there's a melee going on, when things are crazy and wild, his tone just seems to add a touch of sadness, something completely different to it. Whether that be Crimson, whether it be Foreigner, whether it be Driver's Eyes, his first solo album, which I absolutely adore. But that's a cheat, because he was obviously part of Crimson at key points. Sometimes a guest, sometimes part of the band, but so that doesn't count. So you think, well, what else can you get? A really strong vocalist. So you think somebody like Peter Gabriel, because that's somebody that had such a strong style. And I gave it some serious thought and thought, that would either be phenomenal or utter garbage. So that went to the side. And I ended up going back and doing that thing that you used to do with your friends when you were really young. Pick a fantastic band out of all your favourite musicians. Crimson don't seem to be ever going to record ever again. Do they exist right now? Do we know? Doesn't look much like it. So I genuinely kind of thought, who's round now? Who could you construct around Robert Fripp right now? And possibly not, end up with something that would challenge him, something that he would maybe elevate these people around about him. That kind of style that he's got could possibly work with what they've got. So I made a band up, is what I did. I've made a new version of King Crimson, is what I did. So obviously you've got Mr. Fripp himself. I thought, well, you need a bassist and a kind of guy that can play Chapman stick. So Nick Beggs clearly would step into that role. To echo Ken, I think Marco Miniman would be a drummer. But then from there, I think somebody like either Bjornsson from Enslaved, bringing a bit of guitar and synths and a completely different texture, something new and different. A guy that's hot right now on vocals, Ross Jennings, would be perfect for it because he's got a really
Nice
fierce
husky
attack,
voice.
you know, but he can do really sweet things. He can do pop, he can do metal, he can do prog. And I looked at, for a keyboard presence, a real keyboard presence, excuse my pronunciation, Lars Fredrik Froili, is that how you pronounce it? So the guy that's in Wobbler, Caligonaut, White Willow, because there's an awful lot of Crimson kind of in there as well. So yeah, I went and did my own thing here because I found this virtually impossible to do and actually find someone that I could sit here and say, he'd added value to Reid, or he'd added value to In the Court of the Crimson King, or she would have come and did something on Discipline. So I decided to do something else entirely. So apologies, it's a bit of a cheat, but that's my suggestion. There you go.
Okay, hey, that's cool. Outside the box. I love it.
Like it.
Love it.
Well, that also was a hard part of this assignment because of my theory that the last line of the quartet kind of fell apart because Fripp didn't have anybody to really lock horns with. I do think that Mike Keneally has all the talent in the world and more, and I love him. He's just a good guy. He's and a musical freak, but I don't know that he can actually handle a guy like Robert Fripp in that sense because he doesn't have that CV. He has more than most of the people with those CVs in talent. But there you go. But it's not, Mike is just too nice of a guy, So I was thinking, if you're just gonna dream, it has to be somebody that has a lot of pull, a lot of craziness to them. So, and I'm not thinking that there's gonna be another band. I was just thinking somebody that can actually look at Robert Fripp and just sort of handle him well. Somebody who is not going to be satisfied by rehashing ideas, but there's going to be new stuff, right? Something, a different Crimson. That's always a thing, right? A new
Andy
thing.
Partridge?
Yeah. No. I was thinking more along the lines of either you go with somebody more modern, like Danny Elfman, who had the quirkiness of Baloo, but he is actually insane, right? And
Love that choice. Love it.
And has a lot of things to say. I don't know if you guys have heard the latest Danny Elfman record.
Oh, God, yeah.
But
He's
it is
awesome,
out
man.
there.
Oh, yeah.
I highly recommend it. That thing is trippy as hell.
Yes, it is.
And or you can go old school and just imagine, kind of like what I did not know about the Max Roach, but one of my favorite records in jazz is Money Jungle with Ellington, Roach, and Mingus. And I thought, you know what, Charles Mingus and Robert Fripp doing something, even though there's a lot of age difference, it wouldn't work. I'm just thinking, Charles Mingus is not going to get pushed around by nobody. Doesn't give a fuck about anything.
I think he might intimidate the hell out of him.
So I think that sort of thing would allow two people who are very fiercely dedicated to excellence to maybe either murder each other or create something cool, right? I thought that might be interesting. Same thing I could say with somebody like Miles Davis, the trumpet player, something different, right? Marco Miniman is a brilliant suggestion for all the reasons that Ken outlined. I think there's a reason why Marco didn't want the Dream Theater gig. That was just like too, nah, I don't want that, right?
Yep.
And I think something like that would have been much better suited to his temperament. And Marco also plays with Mike Keneally a lot, So there's, I think in a larger context where there are some guys that are locking heads, and then the other guys just sort of inspire, match them, and push. Keneally, Miniman, and then some presence like that, like a Danny Elfman, or maybe another like a jazz, somebody tough, right? To bring ideas and to not take shit from anybody. I think that would have been good. But it has to be something like that, right? And it has to be somebody who looks at Robert Fripp as an equal. And even though the talent is there, you still have to have the credibility, you know.
Mhm.
If nothing else, Danny Elfman's got all the Hollywood dollars, right?
He does.
So there is that, you know.
Hmm.
But that was a very tough assignment. I mean, because really, I have heard things that I never thought I would hear ever from King Crimson. That's the magic, right? They don't owe me anything. They already gave me more than I possibly thought I could get. So frankly, I don't have like a longing for anybody. Of course, I never had an actual keyboard player, you know, somebody who has real
Well,
chops.
Well, Keith Tippett played with them briefly, you know,
But you know, briefly, and he was not really,
Mhm.
you know, I don't know. I don't know what that would have sounded like, because of course now you're treading in the same frequency range as the guitars and the stuff, you know.
That's
you're
why
not-
they just had the Mellotron, using the Mellotron for texture, you know.
Mhm.
Exactly. So even though I could think of several keyboard players that would have been interesting, I think it wouldn't have actually worked in point of fact for that reason.
No, imagine a Tony Banks with Robert Fripp. I think they would have killed each other.
Yeah, or I mean, I was thinking more along the lines of, if you really want to push this septuagenarian guy, bring Hiromi,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
Let's make some cool shit happen, right? Let's
Mhm.
not think it's the 70s. No, that's old, man. Like,
Mhm.
this is this young, awesome Japanese woman who can just play the shit out of the piano, the keyboards,
Yep.
anyway, right? So, and she can write, and she is a good band leader, and she's played with Simon Phillips and top people, right? It's not like so yeah, somebody that has a lot of strength of character, who doesn't take shit, I think that would be good. So whoever that was. you know.
Yeah, right. All right, Eric.
Well, Lewis just put a bullet in my theory, because as I was thinking about this, I said, you know, the only thing Crimson has never had is a keyboard player that's out front. And obviously, I got your guys' thoughts on that, but you wouldn't have thought Ballou and Fripp would have worked, correct? Two guitar players. Why would Fripp want another guitar player? So I went the route, and yeah, you know, there's a lot of Mellotron there, but there was never really, and like Chuck said, Tippett, cat food, and I mean, that's fantastic. But I'm thinking maybe a keyboard player would work. And these lineups came and went so quickly. So if it didn't work, you're gone, right? You do one album and you're gone. So since we're missing one of our key cast members tonight, why don't we raise a glass? And I'm going to bring Eddie Jobson in.
No.
Cheers.
And I only say that because my favorite, I did say the Starless lineup was my favorite, but if we go with the red lineup,
USA.
we don't have Cross with violin. I know he's a guest. So now you, well, we could have Yanni, but you've got Jobson who can play keyboards and violin.
Yep.
You know, so I thought of him, and I thought of Kerry Minier might be another one, because he played vibes and cello. I just like Crimson. Like I said, I like full power. I like horns. I like everything they brought to the table. I like a full band. So why not give keyboards a shot? So there you go, Anthony.
Eddie would work.
You're
I think
a nice guy,
Eddie would
Eric.
work. Yeah, Eddie would work. By the way, Anthony did not pick Eddie. He picked Stephen.
Oh.
He picked Stephen
Steven.
Wilson, actually.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Really?
Well,
Okay.
Why?
I mean, okay.
well, Gavin was already a member, so I
Yeah.
guess Stephen Wilson makes sense, right?
Mhm.
All right. So you ready for mine? So I was thinking about this all week. And
Please don't say Ace Frehley.
no. And so once I finally decided like what my favorite lineup was going to be, I was like, all right, so God, you know, I started a lot of the things you guys were doing, thinking a keyboard player, another drummer, you know, who, right? Violin player, whatever. So I started thinking, well, wouldn't it have been kind of interesting? And this was very inspired by a show I did over the weekend. Wouldn't it have been interesting around the time of Red, you know, Robert basically kicked David Cross out. and kind of did that album as a trio. And then, of course, by the time the album is done, he's thinking about, just calling quits to King Crimson, right? But the other two guys were still interested in carrying on. So what happens if, say, he's like out of the pub and in comes walking John McLaughlin, and the Mahavishnu Orchestra had just kind of called it quits with that original lineup. And the two of them said, hey, yeah, this is kind of not really happening over here. And this is kind of like on its last legs. Why don't we kind of put ourselves together and see how it works out? And then all of a sudden you have the first two guitar lineup of King Crimson, or maybe you don't even call it King Crimson: Robert Fripp, John McLaughlin, Bill Bruford, and John Wetton. Because then you've got the loudest lineup of Crimson, the loud Mahavishnu Orchestra. Forget the violin, forget the keyboards, all power, all together, even if it's just for one album.
Oh,
Interesting.
geez.
You wonder
Just think about
Fripp guitar styles would mesh.
I don't know, because I listened to, Intermounting Flame and Birds of Fire, Between Nothingness and Eternity, and Fripp's intense playing on those albums. I don't know. Because also I was thinking about, because we did the McLaughlin show over the weekend, and I went and listened to Love, Devotion, Surrender again, and listened to Santana and McLaughlin just trading off the whole time. And I'm like, I think it would be pretty cool to hear Fripp and McLaughlin doing the exact.
And you talk about two totally different styles too. The absolute power of McLaughlin and the soulfulness and the beauty of Santana. That probably might have worked. It might have worked.
I could hear it. I could hear it in my head. I'm hearing it right now.
Yeah.
I'm hearing something. I don't
know. I think that's actually a pretty good idea, but more along the lines of a record like Industrial Zen. I think that's where Fripp just really fits like a glove. I think. Because that other explosive, fiery fusion stuff, I mean, I'm not saying that Fripp can't play it, right? Because all that guy does is practice. But it's just not. It's a different thing, right? I mean, he's been moving in that direction. Even back in those days, I mean, the 70s were different, of course. Right? 70s were different. Different Fripp, different thing.
Yeah. So who knows? Just an idea. Right?
I do have to throw in an honorable mention of someone I thought of just now. I think this may have worked.
Yeah.
Don't you think a little accordion? He's had every other instrument. Why not some accordion?
Hey, why not?
I could hear that in my head too.
Oh man, that doesn't sound too good.
That'll be everyone's nightmare tonight, right?
Oh man, jeez.
Polka, the construction of polka.
Oh man, very quickly. I'm also thinking about two guys that actually auditioned for King Crimson, but were turned down. One was Brian Ferry, and the other was Elton John. Just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah.
Elton John.
Elton John, yes.
I can't see it.
So he lost out to King Crimson.
I think some things were just not meant to be.
Hey, he could have wound up in Gentle Giant too, right? It's like,
yes, Gentle Giant. Yep.
Crazy. Well, there you have it, everybody. A nice lengthy conversation about King Crimson, our favorite and least favorite lineups, and some musicians who we thought might have been cool if they joined King Crimson at some point in time. So please, in the comments below, list your favorite lineup, your least favorite lineup, and anybody who you thought would have been a good addition to the band at some point during their career. And remember, there's no right or wrong answer, but except if it's Anthony's, right? So, sorry, Anthony. We love you. We miss you. Hope you're good, man. We'll see Anthony next week here. So thanks for watching, everybody. Visit us on the web at www.seaoftranquility.org. We're on Facebook. We're on Twitter. Of course, we're here on this thing called YouTube. Together all the damn time. For Chad Hutchinson and Ken Golden, Chuck Alvarez, Stephen Reid, Eric Porter, and Louis Nasser, I am Pete Pardo. Good night, everybody. See you next week.
Good night. Good night, everyone. Good night.
Cheers.
Night.